Okay, let's start here. This is a dope sheet. Dope in English means information. This is the day of the coup d'etat. What happened, and I show here with a drawing. When I sent my film to Paris, it was undeveloped. So to show the people in Paris who developed the film what was on the film, I had to write a little note like this, showing what was there. So in the morning of the 11th of September, here's the Moneda, the tanks came down the street, turned around the plaza, and I think here's La Nation, the paper. There were about 4 tanks here, and about 100 personnel, and they all opened fire of the front of the Moneda. The noise was incredible. I mean, for about 10 minutes, everybody fired. And I think the Chilean army, when they train, they get maybe 5 rounds to fire. But this day, they could fire as much as they wanted to. So everybody had a great time of firing. It was a total coincidence. I arrived in Buenos Aires on the 1st of January 1973. I went to the different media organizations I'd worked with in Vietnam and Cambodia, to CBS Television, ABC Television, Newsweek, Time Magazine. And the bureau chief of Time Magazine said, if you go to Chile, I'll give you work. And I needed to work, so I went to Chile. I left home when I was 16 and traveled around Europe a bit. Then at the age of 18, I left for Australia. And my parents worried, my mother especially. So to show what I was doing and what I was experiencing, I photographed what I was doing and sent her the film. Till in 1968, I walked into Vietnam and started photographing the war. And I found out that I could make money by taking pictures. And that's how I became a photographer. This was the day of the Tancazo. That was the only time in my time in Chile that people were not friendly with me. The rebel soldiers threatened to kill me every time I tried to take a picture of them. And I've never worked for a newspaper. I've had a day here or a day there, but I was always freelance. But when I photographed for Time Magazine or Newsweek, I photographed what they want me to photograph. It's kind of interesting. On the 29th of June, Newsweek had hired me for half a day to photograph a women's demonstration. And the women's demonstration was supposed to start at 9 o'clock in the morning. And when I arrived, there were jeeps and tanks, and it was the beginning of the coup d'etat, of the Tancazo. When I went to Newsweek with my film, there was it was the first woman's bureau chief for Newsweek magazine. They always had men, this was the first woman. And she said, did you get it? And I asked, what do you mean, the women's demonstration? You know very well what I mean. Did you get it? I said, yeah, I got the Tancazo. Okay, give it to me. And I was hired for half a day. That meant $75 for half a day. And I said, I want a full day plus space in the magazine. And she became hysterical and said, everybody is against me, everybody is against me. and she wouldn't pay, and I sent the film to Paris. There was this one general who had an American helmet on, an American field jacket, an American M1 rifle, a pair of binoculars on his chest, around his neck. He looked like General Patton, you know, the Chilean General Patton. The other officers had gray coats of the Prussian, more or less, style army. That was the first time. There's also the picture of the first time I ever photographed General Pinochet was at the end of the Tancaso. With General Prats and General Pickering. More or less from 1973 till after the coup d'etat, and then after the coup d'etat, 3-4 months after the coup d'etat, and a year after the coup d'etat, I have the whole story here in the contact sheets of what happened during that time. And the miners' strike was, before the riots in Santiago, were kind of friendly. They were useful. They would start usually at 10 o'clock in the morning. Very often the right would start it by throwing small denomination coins at the left. The left would answer with stones, the right would answer with stones, and then there would be running street battles. One moment everybody would run that way, the next moment they all run that way. And if you take a look at my book, Chile, El Archivo Fotográfico, 1973, 1974, you see one page where they all run in one direction, and you see Benidorm in the picture, and the next moment they all run the other way with Benidorm in the picture. But after the strike of the miners, where they wanted 41% pay increase, and it was also the strike for doctors, nurses, nearly all salaried people had a fixed salary, and with the tremendous inflation of the escudo, had no more purchasing power. And now the adults had come into the scene. Molotov cocktails were being thrown at the Carabineros, and it became a fight not between the youthful right and left, it became a fight between the right and the Carabineros and the left. And it became much more violent. People were shot, cars, buses were burned. There were more power lines blown up by the right and the left. It became serious. The friendliness had disappeared. And here we have some pictures of the riots before and during the miners' strike. These are only a few of the contact sheets. I mean, I had to go through 8,000 pictures to come up with 300 plus pictures for my book. So, and I think here there are about 800 images, and there were 8,000. So there are lots more contact sheets, there are a lot more pictures. The problem with many photographers is that they have a point of view. I mean, the Chilean photographer, especially the photographer who works for a newspaper or a media outlet, because he wants to earn money and he wants to be published. So his opinion is the opinion of the owner of the magazine or newspaper. He doesn't show reality. He shows the truth from the side of the magazine and newspaper. So during my time in Chile, in Santiago, there were 13 newspapers, all saying something different. You had to read 13 newspapers to get an idea of what actually happened in Chile. And I don't think that most photographers have really an opinion of their own. They have an opinion of their friends, because after they take the pictures, if their friends say, hey, I didn't like your pictures, they can maybe lose their friends. So, but I was freelance. I really didn't know anybody. I met people here but I met people here of the right, of the left. Everybody was nice to me. Maybe because I was tall and I had blue eyes and blonde hair. I was a foreigner. But for many people, especially the left, I was also a Yankee gringo de la merda. You know? So we went around the corner. So the soldiers were firing like this. We went around the corner and we watched the bullets hit the front. After we were maybe 6 or 7 or 8 people here, local boys and a couple of middle-aged men. We were curious what was happening. And one of them had a transistor radio. And he told us that the military had just announced that Allende either had to surrender or they would bomb the Moneda. Let's put it this way, Europe was never that interested in Latin America. And there was a little bit of interest because Allende had communists in the government. So there was a little bit of written about Chile in the newspapers, but really very little. The interest really came after the coup d'etat. You know, after the pictures appeared of General Pinochet with his dark glasses, the coup, really, that set it off. This was the very beginning of the coup d'etat, when the first tanks rolled around the Moneda. These are the pictures when the first soldiers entered the Moneda and pushed everybody outside on the street. First they had to lean against the wall, and then they were all put in front of the tank like sardines in a box. We waited for about 15 minutes. Nothing happened, and we went here at the Ministry of Defense. There was nothing here. There were a couple of tanks, cars here were totally crushed by tanks. And then we walked back, and then we heard the roar of jet engines and a big boom. So we turned around the corner and ran here, and there was this cloud of dust coming towards us. And then not long after, we saw the Moneda was burning. We were here, and the jets took off, and it was dead quiet, and you could only hear the crackling of the fire of the Moneda. The Chilean flag was slowly burning, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came a black dog, barking furiously at the sudden silence. And it ran around here, back and forth, and finally stopped in front of me, and I photographed it with the burning Moneda in the background. I mean, my neighbor denounced me as a communist. My neighbor, a young woman, on the evening of the coup d'etat, after I came back from photographing it all, she invited my partner and I over to watch television. And because the junta was going to announce that they had taken over the government. So I photographed the television screen, and we had a talk and had something to drink. And then we went home. The next day was the toque de queda, 24 hours. But on the 13th, we could go out to buy bread. When we came back to the apartment, our downstairs neighbors, 2 elderly ladies, said, you have to be careful. Your neighbor wanted us to denounce you as a communist. So we went home, we hid our film because we were afraid that the military would take it. And about an hour later and 7 soldiers entered the apartment, and they searched the apartment. They found the film from Sylvain, and immediately the guns and, what is this, bombs, They took all the communist magazines like Newsweek, Time magazine, I think it was a copy of Life magazine, The Economist, and a book by Pablo Neruda. And they left. I left Chile on the 21st of September, so that's 3 days after I took the picture of Pinochet with the dark glasses. I shipped the film from Buenos Aires, and 2 or 3 months later, I saw my picture in the newspaper or in the magazine, and I said, "Oh, this is my picture." But that's the first time I saw it, because usually I ship my film abroad to France because I work with a French photo agency, and undeveloped. So my girlfriend would go to the airport, find a passenger to Paris, and would give her a package with a film in it, undeveloped. And it was a different time. You could still give packages to passengers without them saying, "Oh, no bombs for me." Life has changed. The image of Pinochet as a dictator was used all over the Western world. In Germany, it was used on banners, on posters, during demonstrations. They made any movement who didn't like their own president or prime minister. They used the Pinochet picture, plastered the picture of Margaret Thatcher, Macron, Obama, the Brazilian president, on the face of Pinochet. I think Pinochet became an icon, the opposite of the picture of Che Guevara. Che Guevara was the symbol, the icon for the left, and Pinochet, the icon of a dictator. His publicity or propaganda was very good, much better than that of Allende. But then Pinochet had Federico Willoughby, who used to be the PR for the Ford Motor Company, and was apparently also a good friend of Pinochet. And he arranged all the events. I mean, the press always got a notice from the junta. This is happening, that is happening. I mean, when I photographed Pinochet in Iglesia, that was a small church, that was by invitation. Except at that time, I decided not to go because I already photographed the junta 4 or 5 times. It was always the same faces, non-smiling, always sitting. And I said, I'm not going to go. I mean, those pictures, who cares? But then around 10 o'clock, I decided, got nothing else to do, might as well go. There was only one problem. When I got closer to the church, like a half a kilometer, the road was blocked by military. There were machine guns on the roof, the military everywhere. And they said, give me a press pass. Well, I didn't have a press pass because I didn't answer. And then there was a man in civilian clothes, and he said, es el flaco holandés, let him pass. So there were 2 more barricades, and they let me pass. I arrived at the church, and ex-President Frey just arrived, and ex-President Alexandre. I photographed them. Then I filmed inside the church, and there I saw for the first time in a row the general of the Carabineros, and then I think there was the Marine, and then Air Force Lee, General Lee. And it's kind of funny because I was closer than, I was maybe this distance from you. And they looked everywhere except at me. While I was standing right in front of them photographing, I was kneeling in front of them. All the photographers were somewhere over there, on a distance, and I was 2 meters away from them. And I systematically went from one to the next, and Pinochet looked straight at me. Not smiling, just straight into the lens. And nearly every time I photographed Pinochet, you can see it on the contact sheets, he looked straight into the lens. I was much taller than everybody else. I was most of the time dressed in white, innocence. And he always looked into the lens, because I think he, and I thought of this later after I'd worked for 15 years in Hollywood. People who want to relate to their public look into the lens, because when you open the magazine, he looks at you and you feel closer to him. So I think he understood this process, or maybe it's Willoughby who gave him the idea, but he always looked at me. And when I came back for Christmas in 1973, I wondered if they would let me into the country, because the picture had gone around the world of the image of a Latin American dictator. But I was told at the airport that he seemed to like the picture. So I was allowed in, and I took more pictures, but it was more difficult. People would come up to me in the street and say, you cannot take that picture, you cannot do this. And I don't know if they were police in civilian clothes or just good patriotic citizens of the right. But I was sometimes followed in the street. My telephone was tapped. And in the end, the police would come by and at the end of the day and demand the film I'd taken during that day. But usually my partner had already taken my film to the airport. So we would meet somewhere away from the apartment. She would take it to the airport. And when we knew that the airplane had taken off, I would go home and give the film, because usually after I got home, it was 5 minutes, and then they would knock on the door. And kind of smiled and said, we're just doing what we're told. They were always friendly. The only time, even the soldiers who entered my apartment, apart from when they found the film, and they were scared that it might be bombs or something like that, they were also very correct. But they wouldn't give me my book of Neruda back. This was kind of the end in 1974. I'd taken a picture of General Pinochet in Iglesia de Gratitud Nacional. And the Cardinal Enriquez had blessed the junta, still thinking that once the junta had taken over the government, they would return to civilian rule. But a year after, they had taken more power than ever. And the cardinal did not want to bless the regime again. So Pinochet decided a military priest could not refuse him. So he did it in the Escuela Militar. And here are the 4 wives of the 4 generals. Here are the generals waiting to get their medals. And here are the priests. The generals are here, the wives are here. And this is the end when I photographed General Pinochet with a cross behind him. And that more or less was the last photo I took of General Pinochet. And I think by this time he had been everybody you would want him to be. He was a dictator, an authoritative figure. He was a gentleman officer. You can see that also in the contact sheets, where he received us in his office in Diego Portales. He was a grandfather with his grandson. He was a gentleman host in the garden of his house. And he was the good Christian leader in the Escuela Militar. So people could pick which image they liked of him or didn't like. And that's the last I saw of Pinochet. And things had changed. people became more suspicious. People didn't talk anymore. They were afraid of their neighbors. People were denouncing each other. A totally different atmosphere. The reason that there are many more pictures of Pinochet than Allende is the press department of Pinochet was much, much better than the press department of Allende. They knew much more how to handle the press. We were getting invitations to take part in an event, always to show the good side of the junta. So the outside was always to help the junta, and if the journalist did not want to look any further, he would not talk about what happened underneath. People are uncertain, they're afraid, and people are basically, you might agree with that or not, but basically have a slave mentality. They want somebody to take care of them. They want to feel safe. They don't want problems. And therefore, people are weak. And the weak always demand a dictator to protect them from the outside world. So I think the Chilean people who are afraid of what is happening, and not only in Chile, I think there's over the whole of the Western world. People in Europe also are leaning more and more to the right. They're afraid of immigrants, they're afraid of different colored people, they're afraid of different languages, they're afraid. And the one way to control people is through fear. Because fear is what keeps us alive. If we're afraid, we'll run away from danger, or we protect ourselves, or we ask somebody else to protect us. So for the government to create fear in people works towards this goal of total control. And that's what you get, total control. No democracy and no freedom, and I don't think any safety either. Photo has always had a power. You know, my pictures, I always wanted, with the photo agency I worked with, to sell to everybody. Left, right, center, up, down, I don't care. Because I think that in the end, at that time, I'm talking about the 70s, it would even out. Now the press is totally controlled by one or two or three conglomerates. And it doesn't make any difference. Every newspaper has the same line, the same story. There's no diversity anymore. There's no diversity of thought anymore. You're not allowed to have a different thought. The extremely rich have become more and more powerful. And they control now all the media. So you only have one opinion. No other opinion is allowed. In Europe, RT, Sputnik, and any other Iran television, any voice which is different than the government narrative is forbidden. If you have a different opinion than the government in public, you might lose your job, or you might even go to jail. There is no more democracy, if there ever was. And that makes people more afraid. I don't know what else to say. I'm glad I'm not 18 years old. I prefer to be 80, which I am now.